to Everard Junction. Today we're going to be doing a layout update, as I've been quite busy on various parts of the layout over the past few weeks. I've been doing lots of jobs all over the new section of the layout, the section that I've rebuilt over the past couple of videos, and as you're probably aware, there were numerous small areas where it needed to be tied back in to the original part of the layout, lots of little scenic things that needed finishing off and just getting rid of those rough edges and missing links between that new baseboard and the rest of the layout that previously existed. So you can see in front of you there's quite a large section there that obviously I've been working on, and that now ties the old baseboard into the new baseboard, and we now have scenery going all the way to the back scene. I've also done lots of little bits and pieces, so we'll take a look around the whole layout and I'll show you what I've been up to. So perhaps the most major piece of work is the addition of this new signal box and the tying in of the scenery to the rear of the layout where the back scene is. I had intended to do a full video on building the signal box, but unfortunately I came down with quite a nasty chest infection, which turned my voice into this. So it wasn't really practical to do any filming, but I wasn't ill enough to just sit and do nothing. So I went ahead and completed the project. So I'll show you what I've done, and in a future video we'll go through the scratch building. So when I originally planned this layout, I had no intention of fitting a signal box at any point on the entire layout. After all, most of the Great Western Main Line by the time my layout is set would have been controlled by a central signalling centre further afield. The many signal boxes dotted up and down the line was very much a thing of the past by the 1980s. However, when I added all of the additional point work and the small yard to the left of the camera, I decided perhaps now we can justify the existence of a small signal box, with the idea being that it's a 1950s, 1960s built monstrosity in the brutalist style, and its days are numbered. So basically it's clinging on. Many other signal boxes have been decommissioned, but somehow this one still operates. But you can imagine probably in the next 5 to 6 years that British Rail and later Railtrack would get rid of it with signalling improvements in the area. It's also a nice small building that can fill an awkward space, and that little spot there was certainly an awkward space. If you recall back to previous videos, there was this rather awkward sort of notch in the baseboard where the new baseboard met the old one, and I was sort of trying to think of what I could do to make the area look convincing and tie everything in so it all flows nicely. So looking over on this side, this previous retaining wall I built last year, I had that running parallel to the old baseboard. As you can see, what I did was I've pulled it away from the scenery, and being a plastic retaining wall, it's lovely and flexible, so I've managed to bend it into a nice gentle curve, and then that ties in to the new section of baseboard, leaving behind a small area that I can fill up with something such as the signal box. Once we get past the signal box, you can see the retaining wall continues all the way to the very end there, just by the class 31. That's as far as I've got. It will of course continue around the corner as well to frame the area properly and give a proper sense that this is a real retaining wall. And of course you can see I've added some more of those Wills bridge girders just to further add a little bit of realism to the bridge, with the various girders and stuff showing the structure there and where the bridge goes. So the signal box itself is scratch built, and I used my Cricket Maker machine that you have seen on the channel in previous videos to produce this. There's lots of different signal boxes out there in terms of kits, and I had a good look around at different kits and things available, and there wasn't any particular kit or ready-made item that I really wanted or it really struck me. They weren't quite perhaps brutalist enough, didn't have that 60s sort of look. There are things like the Art Deco style of signal boxes that Bachmann do produce as part of their Scenecraft range, and I do actually have one of those, but it just was lacking something for me. It just wasn't, I suppose, ugly enough. The building is made from 2mm card underneath, and then I've clad that with plasticard, both in the embossed brick and a few V-grooved pieces, as well as a few just flat straight pieces to represent the concrete lintels above and below the window. I've also used a couple of kits in its construction, so you can see there is a flight of steps there leading up to the signal box. That's a scale model scenery fire escape kit, and the main windows themselves are also a scale model scenery kit. So I based the dimensions of the building around a section of the assembled scale model scenery windows, and that just sort of gave me the basis to work with. And then I looked at various signal boxes from back in the day up and down the country, and just sort of combined several of their sort of features into one signal box. So you can see we've got the brick construction, the large square windows with the sort of classic flat top roof that overhangs on all four sides of the building. During the construction I painted various parts, and then when it all came together I gave it a final weathering. I've also made sure to do my best to make sure the joints in the brickwork on the corners is very well concealed, very well hidden, as brick plasticard can look a little bit clumsy when you join it together on a corner, so that's always something that's a little bit of a challenge. I decided to paint it in a sort of red brick style similar to the surrounding architecture, and you can see it's got a fair bit of weathering on it as well to make it look a little bit grimy and run down, as it would have been getting on for 30-35 years old by the time my layout is set, and certainly its days would be numbered. It's unlikely it would have survived for much longer before its roles were taken over by a signalling centre. Perhaps the bit I'm most pleased with on the building is the interior. It has a full interior, and I've also fitted lighting to the building, so in the dark it looks quite good, and during the sort of normal time when I've got the lights on in the attic and I'm just running trains, those big windows really do reveal the interior, and when you look straight across the line you can see inside. So I made sure to add an interior. I did contemplate not doing it as it is quite a bit of effort, but given the size of the windows it really shows off the interior inside the building, so it would have looked a little bit strange if it was just completely empty. The roof of the building is removable, so let's take a closer look at the interior. So I've tried to keep it relatively simple, just focusing on the main sorts of things that you will see through the windows. So first of all we have lighting. I fitted a lighting bar to the top of the signal box here, and that's just using some of that LED strip. It's like a roll of tape with LEDs on it, so there's just a strip of LEDs in there, and I've just covered that with some plasticard and boxed it all in so it looks a little bit like a real light fixture. The structure then turns off to this side, and that's just to run the wires, which then run down the wall, go through the floor and out through the bottom of the baseboard where I can plug them in. The main interior of the signal box consists of carpet tiles from scale model scenery. They're just printed out on the paper sheet, so I just cut those out and glued those into position. We've also got a few chairs here, as well as my attempt at a control desk. I sort of looked at a couple of different interiors for signal boxes, looking at the Westinghouse miniature lever frames that were quite often utilised in the 1960s signal boxes, and whilst this is not an accurate model of a particular control panel or control desk, lever frame or whatever you want to call it, it certainly does the job when looking through the windows. It's made from card and various offcuts from numerous kits that I've had lying around for a couple of years, and you can see I've painted it a sort of British Rail corporate blue sort of colour, and there's a few magazines and things and lots of buttons and knobs, switches, levers, things like that. And then on the back wall of the signal box we see we've got a map of the surrounding area. That's again just a generic picture I got from a picture of a real signal box. Once inside the signal box, it's so small you're not really going to be able to read it or show, that it's not an exact copy of my layout, but it certainly does the job, looks the part. So I'll pop the roof back on and we'll have a look at it in the dark with the lights on, and you'll get a better idea of how things look. You can also see on the top of the building some of the underlying card structure. You can see the tabs that I've designed into the building, so all of the parts lock together. So it really is a very strong little structure, and it should last for years to come. It should be very resistant to moisture and any warping. Inside the roof you can see there's a corresponding piece so that it all locates onto the roof correctly and just fits in place like so. So I've just switched on the lights inside the signal box, and even with the lights on in the room you can see how obvious the interior is. So it would have looked a bit odd with nothing in there at all, which is why I decided to spend the extra couple of evenings putting one together. So there with the lights off, hopefully you can see some of the details, particularly on the control panel and the sort of chairs and things that are scattered around. You can see the two guys in there, also the older gentleman stood in the centre looking out onto the tracks. You can see he's got a pair of glasses and a tie. Certainly wasn't easy to paint, but looks the part. I'm quite pleased with that. And although this camera does struggle to pick it up, the building does illuminate the surrounding area very slightly, with some of the tracks being visible, and it really does create quite a sort of atmospheric scene. So I'm well chuffed with that, and that's the first of many lighting projects I hope to add to the layout this year, certainly down on the town scene with the terraced houses and various other buildings. As you can see, we've got the retaining wall at the back there, and then there's this extended head shunt siding here. This previously was quite short. As I said earlier, I've extended it just to fill up the area where the bridges are, as it was going to be difficult to do any sort of scenery behind the bridges or anything like that. So I thought, well, let's extend that siding. There's no harm in doing that. I can then park a loco in there and display a loco as such, and then we've got the signal box at the end that just ties up the awkward little transition where it goes back to the layout itself. And then I was going to put between the flats and the signal box some tall trees, so you can just see the tops of those behind the retaining wall, and it just all adds to the scenery and make sure that we've got something always from the back scene all the way to the front of the layout. I'm trying to get away from these areas now on the layout where it's just bare plywood. Of course, I've made sure to add the graffiti, as you would of course seen it in an area like this. So certainly around the bridges, plenty of graffiti. And then as we move up towards the small yard, the level of graffiti decreases, as it's less likely that someone who wants to do a tag is going to walk all the way up here when they can just do one by the bridge. I've also added some much needed signage. We've got a few speed limit signs in position. These are a scale model scenery kit that I've had in my drawer for a couple of years now. So I decided to install a few of those. And as you can see, I've gone for the round type, which was coming into service in the late 80s, early 90s, and became the standard for displaying speed limits on the railway. On the branch line, I've gone for the older type, as the branch line sees less maintenance and it's not yet been updated with the new signage. These particular signs are 3D printed, and you can get those from West Hill Wagon Works, and Scale Model Scenery also make a kit of their own as well. After painting, I made sure to give these a light weathering, and I did the same for the round style of speed limits, which are over by the signal box. So moving on from the signal box, hopefully you've noticed the various small plants, bushes and shrubs dotted around the various areas on the new section of the layout here. And that's something that I've started to add in the last couple of weeks. I've always found it really difficult to find convincing looking plants and small bushes and shrubs and things like that, preferring just to use things like the Woodland Scenics coarse foliage and sea foam trees and cutting them into smaller sections. I've always steered away from plants and bushes and stuff like that, as I've always found them to be very vibrant in colour and stick out like a sore thumb when you put them on the layout. It's something I've looked into every couple of months for a few years now, and I stumbled across a little eBay shop that sells various bushes and plants, some of which you can see in front of you, and I'm really pleased with them. They really blend into the surrounding scenery, certainly the colours that I like to use on my particular layout, and they're not really vibrant and green and in your face like so much of the sort of stuff that you tend to see for sale. So these are sold by an eBay shop called Tajima One. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, and they're really useful. Self-adhesive, they come on some like wax paper. You just peel them off and place them on the layout. You can also cut them up with scissors into smaller sections if you find they're a bit too large for the scene you're trying to create. The bushes are my favourite. They've got a really quite realistic looking texture to them, and as I say, they can be cut up into smaller sections. The colour is really good. It's a sort of olive green sort of colour, not this vibrant luminous stuff that you see all over the place. It blends in really nicely to surrounding scenery without sticking out. They also do these tall flowering plants. I suppose it'd be foxgloves or whatever you want, any random flowering sort of bit of shrubbery, and quite pleased with those. Different colours available. I've gone for the purple, the white and the yellow, but they're available in just about any colour you want depending on what you're trying to portray, and these sort of tucked into the bushes look really good. And again, you can also trim them down, some of the bits perhaps a little bit tall, a little bit vibrant, so you can trim them to your liking. And again, not a really vibrant colour, it just sort of nicely blends into the surrounding scenery with things like the sort of woodland scenics products and the sort of olive green sort of colours that I like to use on this layout. The bushes are available in two colours. There is a more vibrant green, which I've used in a few places around the layout. And there you can see some of the yellow plants as well. Just add a splash of colour to otherwise very sort of green looking area. And as I say, I'm quite pleased with those. So we'll go around the layout and I'll show you a few places where I've installed them, and then we'll move on to the next bit. So over on the section that I built in the previous video, you can see some of that. So we've got some of the two shades of green and also some of that purple flowering plant in position there. And I find once I've installed them, if you sprinkle over a little bit of the coarse turf, again the sort of olive green burnt grass colour, it blends them in to the surrounding scenery. And again, hopefully there you can see what I mean. A little bit of the coarse turf from Woodland Scenic sprinkled over the top of those plants and bushes once they've been installed, and it just blends them into the surrounding scenery. And then we've created a relatively sort of grotty, urban-looking environment with plenty of weathering and dirt, but we do have a little bit of that sort of green stuff, give the place a little bit of vibrance. Another spot this was crying out for was over on the countryside section of the layout, so I've started to add some of that into various places, and you can see how it just adds a little bit of a splash of colour in a few places that was certainly very much needed. And here you can see some of those bushes and flowers and such in this section. There you can see there's a selection of them planted on the hillside just there. Some of the other plants I picked up were from War Painter Scenics. Again, these were from eBay, and I went for these flowers in various colours, and again it just adds a little bit of a splash of colour, especially the white and the yellow. I was quite pleased with those. It looked like those sort of spring, summer flowering plants. The bed of these is quite a vibrant green static grass, but with all the flower detail on top, it does cover up most of it, so I made an exception here and went for those. But you can see, if you look at the base grass itself versus the grass I have here on the layout, you see the massive difference in shade there, and that's what I don't like about a lot of the various flowers and tufts and things that you can buy in various places. You get these really luminous green colours, and I don't think it scales very well, and certainly looks a bit odd in comparison to, say, something like this. However, in isolation, with some extra bits and pieces scattered around and some of that coarse turf, the burnt grass colour, sprinkled over the top, I think these look quite good once they're installed. So moving away from the signal box and the area at the back of the layout, I've also spent quite a bit of time focusing on tying up loose ends in the town scene area. If you remember previously, when I installed the new baseboard to the rear of this scene, there was lots of bits of bare baseboard and bits of foam showing where the retaining walls and things no longer tied properly into the scenery. So behind these terraced houses, I've been hard at work making sure things look a little bit more respectable. While we're looking at the houses, we'll just touch on some progress I've made on these. I started construction of these about a year ago, and every now and again I take them downstairs and just spend an evening doing some more detailing to them. It is taking a very long time. There are a number of buildings here, and there's lots of details to add. But I am slowly winning the battle with completing these houses, and as you can see, they have changed a little bit since you last saw them. So we now have the addition of various gutters and drain pipes on the front of the buildings. We've also got the roof tiles on the sloped part of the roof, extending all the way down the properties, all the way to the end. They're a laser cut kit. You can get those on eBay, and you can also get them from Scale Model Scenery. And they do take quite a while to glue into position and cut, and all the associated painting and things like that. But certainly look the part. I've also added some sort of tar type mattings, shed felt, whatever you want to call it, to the roof of the buildings, and I've painted those in different colours. I've also added all of the plasticard to the top sections of the sort of walls separating the properties, and applied various weathering and stuff to that as well. The next little job on these houses is to install the rest of the chimney pots, and as you can see, I've got one installed at the moment. And just quickly to address some comments I've had about these on previous videos, I've been told that the chimneys are located in the incorrect place. You've got the doors to enter the properties here, and then the chimney in the centre, and apparently you wouldn't have chimney breasts on the side that the doors open out into, certainly from the front of the building. And I see the logic behind that, but I must stress these buildings are not made up. These are based on real buildings in Cold Harbour Lane, Brixton, London. And whilst I have taken some licence with the ground floor of the properties, the real ones, they're sunken into the earth, more of a basement. Here I've just gone for a 4-storey building. The chimneys on those properties are present on every single wall running between the properties, and that might be something to do with the fact that they are 4 stories. I don't know, I've not visited these buildings in real life, but if you look at them on satellite, there is a chimney pot on every single wall separating the properties. Some of them won't have the chimneys installed anymore, they'll be blocked off, but I will be following the original architecture of the buildings that these are based on. So moving to the end of the houses, you can see quite a significant change over in this area. In a previous update, I did mention how I wanted to change what was going on at this section of the layout. Previously it was looking rather more run down than it does now. There was lots of graffiti, and it had a little bit more of an industrial vibe about it. But given its proximity to the houses here, the domestic houses, I thought perhaps it's a little bit too industrial for my liking, especially with what I want to do moving further down the layout over the next few videos, working in this direction. I thought it wasn't going to work quite so well. So as you can see, the locals have been out, and there's been a bit of an effort to clean up the area. So the first thing I decided to do, which you often see in real life, was to paint over the graffiti that I'd added in some of the sections on this wall, and just tidy things up a little bit. So you can see I've gone for a deliberately off-brick maroon sort of colour, an attempt from somebody to try and blend it kind of a bit maybe into the wall. And you can also see the lighter blue on the roller shutter door there, where someone has taken the trouble of painting over the graffiti. The arch next to it still has the graffiti on it, but I didn't want to get rid of all of it. I still wanted to leave a couple of tags, as you would often see that in an area like this. Something else that I've changed is the area here. I was never quite sure what to do when I originally constructed this area. It's an awkward, very small triangle sort of section, and a building in that area wouldn't really be very realistic. So I went back onto Google Street View, Google Satellite, looked around, and I get a lot of that inspiration from areas like Brixton and Battersea, areas of London like that, where there's quite a lot of railway running on a retaining wall such as this one. And I noticed in a couple of areas, certainly around some of the older properties and some of the estates, that where there is an awkward corner of land and they don't really know what to do with it, it's quite often just left in like a raised bed. So they put a brick wall around the edge of it, raise the soil level up a little bit, and then there's a selection of plants or small trees or something. And I think this area now compares a little bit more favourably to the houses that are right next to it. So I'll show you around the back, as that's where a lot of the work has taken place. So when I redid this baseboard and the whole baseboard moved backwards slightly, I suddenly found I had a new area of space behind the houses where I could build the gardens and also include the bit of detail for accessing the industrial units. I now had enough space to construct the industrial units, the alleyway that would serve them, and also the gardens for the houses. And before I built the baseboard, that was going to be quite difficult to do, as I just really didn't have enough space. In real life, it's really tight and cramped in these areas, but this layout was just a little bit too far beyond to actually make that look convincing. So looking behind the houses, you can see I've added in some gardens, and we've got different types of fences, different colours and things going on in there for variation. I've got a sort of fresher looking, more recent fence at the bottom of each garden that's decided, we'll say that's been put up by the council to better protect the gardens from the goings on in the alleyways behind these properties. And you can see I've also added numerous doors and shutters and things to each arch to show the presence of a small unit there that could be rented by somebody. These are still very much a work in progress, but I've got them to a point where they're certainly presentable enough to show them to you. Still lots of bits and pieces to add in, particularly some taller sort of trees and shrubs and things in here that would be overhanging the fences and growing out into the alleyway that you would often see in real life, making it hard to spot these industrial units. So moving down this section with the houses removed, you can get a better look at the gardens or the yards. Very, very small. But once again, if you look carefully at properties like this in London, it is surprising just how small some of the backyards to these places are. So this one on the end is purely just got concrete paving in it, nothing special, a few weeds, nothing more. Here we've got someone who really doesn't care about their garden at all. You can see traffic cone, washing machine, pallet, tyres and scrap bits and pieces laid around. There's even a broken table at the bottom of the garden. There's another garden that's not really tended for. I'll be adding some sort of taller shrubs and bushes in there to show things are getting a bit out of control. Here's one that's actually a little bit more looked after, as well as this one. Perhaps the nicest garden in the row. Even got the presence of a small shed. That's just a Hornby scaled L item, and I've added a little bit of a sort of shrub at the bottom of the garden as well. But most of the gardens are relatively unkept, relatively messy, which you often see from the window of a train as you travel into a large town in the UK. You'll pass lots and lots of houses with small gardens, and quite often the gardens are a bit of a mess. I've also done various different fences just to keep things interesting. You can see we've got the traditional sort of concrete post and wire fence that probably would have come with these when they were built, and then we've got sort of a more modern fence panel, as well as the presence of the sort of more modern looking fence that runs along the back of the gardens, which I've done in the same style, with the idea that that's been put up by the council to better protect the properties from the goings on in the alleyway and these industrial units. You can see on the doors a little bit of graffiti, a little bit of weathering in a few places. Still lots of bits and bobs to do, but you get the idea. The big shutter door on the right is for a small garage, and that's a kit from Scale Model Scenery. These ones here are my own making, my own design. They're made of plasticard and a few strips of laserboard, which I just cut out on the Cricut Maker machine that I used to make the signal box. Painted them in some appropriate colours and done a bit of weathering, a bit of graffiti. Not quite finished yet, but hopefully you get the idea. Moving further down, I've got another shutter door, different size this time, Scale Model Scenery kit. As you can see, I'm trying to make sure that the doors on these are all slightly different, as it's very rare to see the exact same door on every single arch. It's always going to have a story, history, and some of the doors will be much older than others, such as these two here. These are a Scale Model Scenery kit, and it represents the much older sort of timber sliding door arrangement that perhaps these arches had when they were constructed, perhaps about 100 years ago. Another roller shutter door there, different colour, same size as the other one further up, but I've put it in a different spot so it's not so obvious that they're exactly the same. Another one of those traditional sort of early wooden ones. Another door of my own making, and then another large Scale Model Scenery shutter door, and I've gone for the big shutters at either end, as these do have direct access to the road. I've gone for my usual sort of grimy, stodgy sort of ground cover. This is a mix of grey tiling grout, Woodland Scenics Fine brown ballast, and Woodland Scenics Fine grey ballast. I've then airbrushed over that from a distance to create this sort of rundown not necessarily muddy, but hard packed industrial surface. I've got the same thing at the other end, where again we've got road access for this small garage. You might say, would there be a small garage next to a domestic property like this? The answer, certainly in London, is yes. It's surprisingly common, especially in a railway arch. You see all sorts of small body shops, particularly in places like this. You can see we've got a couple of old bangers parked outside the front, and I'll be adding a few extra details and things once we get a little bit further with this scene. I've also done a little bit more work to the fence. As mentioned previously, this entire wall did move back, which created all of this extra space, so I've extended the fence just there, and I've deliberately extended it with a bit of fence that's a slightly different colour, so you get a sense of this sort of history of things being changed and altered and mended and bodged, as you would see in real life. All of those changes also meant that the pavement needed some adaptation, so I've added a load of extra paving slabs to this section here as the wall has moved back. Also added a few in this location here as well, and just started the process of airbrushing and tying everything back together. You can see I've still got double yellow lines and things to finish off with the road markings and stuff like that, but generally speaking this area is now a little bit more tied together and looking quite a bit more respectable. As I say, the gardens are still a work in progress. We need taller shrubs and bushes in there. And you can see how that sort of ties in with the scenery that we've got over the back there as well. You can see how this is one big retaining wall with multiple tracks on it, just like you would see in a large city like London. Over on this section, once again, I'm working on tying up the loose ends. This side here still is just bare plywood, needs plasticard, bricks adding in there, but I have moved this bit of retaining wall so it all lines up properly again. That's moved back a couple of paving slabs, which has opened this area out slightly, and I've made sure to add the paving slabs back in and give them a lick of paint. You can still see there's a bit of work to do. You can see there's some empty space underneath the billboard that needs filling in, and again I've got more work to do on the road markings, but generally speaking I'm pleased with the lack of damage I did to this area when I sort of redid this entire baseboard and moved it all, changed the sizes and everything. I thought, this is really going to damage this area and I might have to start completely from scratch, but that wasn't the case. Luckily I could just move the wall, and as I hadn't built the gardens or anything just yet, it was relatively easy to tie up the majority of the loose ends and then really start working on some of the details. And despite all of that, the Magna Rail road system is still working in this area, still working just fine. Don't really have any problems with it, just sort of switch the cars on and let them run. Once you've got trains running around the layout, the noise that this system makes, you don't really hear it at all. So really pleased I installed that, and really pleased with its performance. Working very well so far. I do have plans to potentially install it in another spot on the layout in the future, and I'll do an updated video on how to install it as I sort of better know how to get the best out of this system. I have done a video previously on installing Magna Rail. If you have a look on the channel, it's one of my older videos, and I've certainly learnt a lot since then, so take that one with a pinch of salt, but you might learn one or two things in there. But generally speaking, it does work very nicely. Very pleased with it. I was a bit worried, doing all of this invasive work and changing all of this around here. I thought we might cause damage to it and have to rip all of this up and start again, but no problem so far. So as you can see now when looking at this section, there's scenery running from the very back of the layout all the way to the front, with the exception of this area here, which I've yet to put a building in, but you get the idea. I'm really looking forward to continuing to work on this area, build things up and create that sort of grimy, rundown appearance. The building to the right, the office building just here, that's already got a full interior and lighting, so that's about ready to go. I'm looking forward to adding lighting to these buildings, getting some street lights installed, looking from this sort of view here with the lit signal box in the background. If I can get all of the other buildings lit with some form of an interior, with trains running past, I think that'll look quite atmospheric, really create a cool looking scene. Turning attention to rolling stock on the layout, I have added some additional items to the rolling stock over the past 3 or 4 months or so. So we'll take a look at those. A couple of second-hand items, a couple of items that were a very good price, and a large pre-order that I'd been waiting on for about a year or so. So a couple of weeks ago I took delivery of 13 of these new Cavalex Tea Wagons. These wagons in real life came into service in the mid to late 1980s. So they're a perfect fit for my layout, as these were seen on the western region behind various forms of traction running up and down the line. And I'm very impressed with the level of detail. They really do look the business. Lots of separately fitted parts, lots of fine detail, and all of the artwork and printing is very, very well done. Everything is legible and everything is where it should be. Along the top of the wagon there's a very nice etched walkway, just like it would be in real life, and one of my favourite details is the presence of the welding seams on the various sections that make up the tanker. Many large tankers that are modelled in this scale in the past are just simply a plastic tube with no representation of the various sections that come together. But as these wagons age and weather in real life, it becomes very obvious where all the weld lines are. Doesn't matter how good a job you do of grinding it all down and making it all smooth, it's still noticeable. Details like that I've always had to add myself in the past, and it's not a particularly easy job, so it's really nice to see that Cavalex have gone to the trouble of really making sure all of the key details are included on this wagon, including these very fine welding lines, which another manufacturer might have ignored. You can see there's also small details on the end of the wagon. We've got a nice ladder there, and also a little bit of pipework, and also the bogies are very nicely picked out as well. From the box you can see the wagons coupled together very closely. That may turn out to be a problem for some of you, which I will demonstrate shortly. And you can also see the correct style of buffers have been modelled there. And incidentally, they are also sprung, which is unusual to see on a freight wagon, and something that I'm not particularly interested or bothered about. I've never really seen the obsession with sprung buffers personally, but it does appear to be the industry standard and what people demand. So they are present on the wagon, and Cavalex have to be praised for including such a detail, although for me it's neither here nor there. General running characteristics has been a little bit hit and miss, as the wagons are so finely detailed. I'll show you a couple of the problems I encountered and how to resolve them, and then hopefully if you've got some of these on your layout and they start showing some issues, you might be able to solve that. First thing to mention is Squeaky Wheels. I'm no stranger to squeaky wheels. I've usually got something running around the layout that's got a squeaky wheel. However, these wagons were an exception. After about a minute of running, I couldn't stand that any longer, so I decided to sort the problem out, and that involved flipping the wagon over and taking a look at the wheels. It is worth pointing out all of the lovely detail that is underneath here. You can see the air tank and all the various bits of plumbing for the braking system. Very, very nicely done. With regards to the axles, these are the usual pinpoint style and are relatively easy to remove thanks to the presence of slots in the bogies, which allow the wheels to be dropped in and out, and also make conversion to EM or P4 scale that little bit easier. To sort the wheels out, I took an extremely small amount of grease, a plastic compatible grease, something from the likes of Tamiya is usually a fairly safe bet, and I applied a minuscule amount to the ends of each axle, and I'm talking a minuscule amount. You do not need to over-grease anything on a model railway. The amount of grease I placed on the ends of each axle is so small that you can barely see it, and that's all it needs to shut them up. There's no need to go in there and put vast amounts of oil or grease into anything on a model railway, and these wagons now run silently as a result of doing that. While I was in here, I checked the back-to-back measurement. That is the distance between the two wheels on each axle. A back-to-back gauge, such as this one from DCC Concepts, is an invaluable tool, and everyone who has a model railway should try and get themselves a back-to-back gauge. It solves all manner of derailments. Placing the back-to-back gauge between the wheels on my examples of the Cavalex Tea Wagon found every single one to be very slightly too tight. So I have opened up the gap by inserting the gauge in every single axle on the entire train, and that has certainly improved the quality of their running, and they no longer seem to dip into the frogs of points and things like that. They seem to be a little bit happier going around some more complex track work. So if we move over to the Fiddle Yard, you can see here's the entrance to the Fiddle Yard. Like many people in the hobby, I am constrained by available space. So all of this is a mixture of second, third and fourth radius curves using Pico curved points to better utilise the space I have and make the sidings in the Fiddle Yard that much longer. Occasionally I do get a derailment in this section with various trains on the layout. You know, it is relatively tight. I am asking quite a lot from some of the models, but let's just see how the TEA wagons compare when running through this Fiddle Yard. So running those into the Fiddle Yard on the gentle curve, we'll check the performance. You can hear how they're now silent. They no longer squeak, and they certainly look impressive in a long rake. Moving into the Fiddle Yard, you can see how they negotiate the corner quite happily, but notice the close coupling and how close the buffers get, even on a fourth radius curve. Something to be mindful of if you have tight corners on your layout, as I shall now demonstrate. So now, instead of going around the outside track, we'll go around one of the inner tracks, and I'll switch the points so that we head into the next track. So be this one here rather than the gentle curve on the outside. Here we're looking at something like a third radius curve, something like that. Not too bad, but still relatively tight. As you can see, they derail quite spectacularly, and this happens every single time. And it always seems to be the same spot on the points. I've tried them on numerous places on the curved points and all the tracks on the layout, and it's always this very first bit where the point blades are just as it goes into the turn. And I wonder if perhaps these Pico points are particularly aggressive in their angle in this location just here. I can't really comment too much because most of my other stuff runs through it without too much trouble at all. Okay, I get the odd derailment here and there, maybe every 20 minutes or so, but nothing severe. These wagons just can't negotiate these curves, but again, they're very well detailed. There's lots of stuff going on, so it's going to restrict the ability for those bogies to swing around, and the close coupling as well also adds another factor. So moving forward, what I may look to do is to remove these Pico curved points and change the entry to the Fiddle Yard to try and see if I can get some more gentle curves. It's going to sacrifice a bit of my storage space, which is a bit of a shame. I've only got so much room up here, so like many of us with model railways, you always try to see what you can get away with. Up till now, most of my rolling stock has run through this maze of point work without really any trouble at all, but these new wagons certainly seem to struggle on the curved points. And as you can see, it's every single time, it's not just a fluke. Something else I've noticed, which is just worth bearing in mind, when these derail, and even just with general handling sometimes, the outermost wheel can drop out of the bogie. This is something I've noticed over the past couple of weeks as I've been playing around with these and running them on the layout, and it's certainly a bit odd. It's not really anything I've come across before on a model on the layout up here, but that seems to be something they do. In fact, one of them in the box even had such an issue. I opened the box and the wheel was just lying in the bottom of the packaging, as you can see on this photograph that I took. So I'm not exactly sure why that happens. I just pop the wheel back in and away it goes. It's just something to be aware of. So that's the Cavalex Tea Wagon. Lovely detail, one of the most realistic wagons I've added to the collection in recent years. Right up there with examples like the Bachmann Polybulk and Container Flat. Really impressive, very nice. Downsides from the box, squeaky wheels. This has been confirmed by a few friends of mine as well. They all seem to suffer from squeaky wheels, and it was also known on Cavalex's previous release, the BBA steel carrier, that they also had a tendency to squeal as well. Not a massive problem, quite fixable, just a little bit of a service on the bench and you should be sorted. Second issue, which was a bit more of a problem for me on this particular layout, is Pico set track curved points. They do not like them, not one bit. They will not negotiate the tighter portion of the Pico set track curved point. However, it is a very aggressive point and it occasionally causes some of my other items of rolling stock to derail. Although I stress that's an occasional derailment. With these, it's a permanent every lap derailment. So moving forward, I'll be looking at making some improvements to the Fiddle Yard and streamlining the approaches into the Fiddle Yard to make these wagons run better, and also just eliminate any other derailments that I may have in future with any other new models that potentially come out with the same problem. 10-15 years ago, it was generally accepted that most models that came out in the UK would go around second radius curves and tight point work and things like that. But with each year that passes, we ask for ever-increasing levels of realism and detail from our models, and certainly with the case of these Cavalex TEAs, we've now reached the point of no return where they're so well detailed, those tight corners and tight manoeuvres on different layouts are no longer possible. Turning our attention to the scrapyard for a moment, I was browsing Goodwood Scenics the other day, and they now make some extra scrap products that they announced a couple of months ago, and I've picked up some of those, so I'll just show you those before they get installed into the scrapyard. I think they're really going to add an extra little bit of detail to this area, and it's certainly something that I would struggle to make on my own. And here they are. These are some scrap cars which are manufactured by Goodwood Scenics, and they also do a selection of doors to go with them. As far as I can tell, these are just based on a generic vehicle. They're not based on anything in particular, but if you squint, they do look a little bit like an Austin Ambassador, which would be perfect as that car came out in the early 1980s and plenty of them had been disposed of by the time my layout is set. These items are 3D printed, and as you can see, they're quite effective. A little bit expensive. You get a pack of 3 in each set, and they do them in a range of colours. Working in classic car restoration, spending the majority of my time doing metalwork, repairing rust, fitting new panels and things like that, I'm used to seeing cars in this state, so I was immediately drawn to this as I really like it, and it would also be an excellent bit of detail to add to the scrapyard, as it's an awful lot of effort to take one of the die-cast models from the likes of Oxford Diecast and painstakingly remove all of the panels, and even then it would be very difficult to create some of the damage and distress that you can see on this example here, such as the big dent in the roof where the car has been picked up by a crane and also had other vehicles stored on top of it. Some really nice little details in there. The remnants of the front seats still being in the car is a nice touch, and there's all sorts of little bits when you look around the car, and also the presence of all of the correct sort of panel work that you would see in real life if you stripped a car to this state. You've got a nice representation of the A-post there. You can see the strut towers and inner wings, some of the workings in the bulkhead sort of area, as well as the B and C post and all of the various structural components that make up the car. Even in the back corner of the boot area, you can see the presence of the inner wing and the wheel tub, as well as the structure that runs along the base of the rear quarter window to mount things like the seat belt. You've also got the rear panel where the lights go, and it's just very nicely done. Whoever designed and came up with the CAD for this knew what a car looked like when it gets taken apart. The doors are also a nice touch. You can see that the outer door skin and the inner door frame have been modelled with the various bits of reinforcement, and also the representation of the window regulator still being inside the door as well. A very nice touch. You can see there's also damage to the sills where it's been picked up by a forklift truck, and rampant corrosion which probably took the car off the road in the first place. You can also see the rear wheel hubs there with possibly a brake drum as well, and even the rear swing arms for the rear axle have been modelled as well. You can see this car's got just traditional sort of beam axle rear suspension. So as I've said a couple of times, a really nice little model, and all the dents and distress all over it makes it perfect for a scrapyard. So I'm going to be doing some extra painting to these. I've got 6 of them, and they'll start appearing in the scrapyard in due course. Taking a look at other items of rolling stock, I've been working over the last 6 months or so to try and acquire a few more items of Engineers rolling stock for the layout. Up until this point, I've had a mixture of the Sea Cow and Sea Lion ballast hoppers from Hornby, but there are many different types of ballast wagon out there, and it's an area of the railway that I have a bit of interest in. To the right, we have a Hornby Sea Lion wagon. Hornby don't make these very often, if at all. I can't remember when the last production run was. Occasionally they'll do a production run of the Sea Cow, which looks almost the same, but the Sea Lion has a few distinct differences, and for some reason Hornby don't run this wagon. Despite being just as well detailed, it's really nice. It looks just perfect next to the Sea Cow wagon, and you can run them together in a mixed train, so I'm not quite sure why Hornby seem to have forgotten about making these. But anyway, I've been scouring eBay for the last year or so, slowly picking up examples as and when they come up for sale, second hand of course, and I've managed to acquire a couple more in the olive green livery, which is the livery that predated the grey and yellow Dutch livery that you can see on the other two wagons. So I'll be using these to make my train look a little bit more interesting, and we'll have some different colours there in the train, and they're not all going to be in the grey and yellow Dutch livery such as they are at the moment. So that's the Hornby Sea Lion wagon. Lovely model, really like them. Don't know why Hornby don't rerun them once in a while, but they don't. You'll find the Sea Cow occasionally, as I say, but this one does seem to be forgotten about. If you can find them, they're an excellent wagon, certainly worth picking up. Moving to the next wagon, this is a Depol Turbot wagon. These were used for carrying waste material and ballast to and from the site, and they were often seen mixed in with other trains and sometimes big long rakes of their own. I've always been sort of interested in these wagons, and the Depol model is quite good. They've recently done another production run. I think some of them are still in stock. Depol are pretty good for that. They always, every year, there'll be a new run of whatever model they've got in their catalogue, and if you're patient and wait a couple of years, you can make a whole train using different running numbers. Something Depol always do a nice job of is regular production runs of all the models that they make. As you can see, I've just started some of the weathering processes for this wagon. I've picked up 4 of them. They're about £24–25, which certainly in this day and age is actually quite a good deal. I almost can't believe I'm saying that, but that is a good deal for a model of a wagon. And as I say, I've got 4 of those, and they'll be making an appearance on the layout once I've finished the weathering process. My only criticism, the yellow is very lemony, it's very vibrant, this is well known. It doesn't appear to have been corrected in this production run, but I'm sure a decent amount of weathering will dull that down, and they'll blend in with other engineering rolling stock that I have on the layout. And finally, this is a Helian Dogfish wagon, another type of ballast/engineering wagon, and I've always been quite fond of these too. These do not get a production run very often and are quite difficult to find, and when they do come up, certainly if they're in as new condition, they can go for quite an extortionate amount of money. I was fortunate in that I was browsing eBay a couple of months ago, and I spotted a set of 5. And they were about £100 if I remember correctly. £100 for about 5 wagons, again in this day and age, that represents a very good deal. So I decided to pick them up. The reason why they were cheap should be obvious. I'm going to be kind and say that they are weathered not to my taste, but shall we say they need reworking, and that is almost certainly why they were listed as being cheaper than a new in box item. Whoever had them before me has converted them to KD couplers, which is absolutely fine. Big fan of those couplers, so that's not a problem. But certainly the weathering, it needs some attention, shall we say. I've just started the process of de-weathering them. The wagon to the right, as you can see, has had a bit of work and a bit of time put into it, and I've managed to get rid of a fair bit of the weathering. Now, they need weathering again. They were always in quite a state, but the weathering is certainly not to my taste, and almost certainly why these were relatively cheap. So that's an ongoing project, and hopefully you'll see them over the next couple of videos. So I'm slowly building up a small collection of vacuum braked engineers wagons, and it'll be nice just to have a little bit more of a different train as opposed to my train of sea cows and sea lions. I'll be able to run some of these wagons as well, mixed in with the sea lion wagons. So should be able to make quite an interesting varied train, which is something I've always liked about the old BR engineering stuff. So there you go, quite a lot to cover in this update. I have been quite busy on the layout. A little bit delayed progress on the videos, of course. I was hoping to do a video all about building that signal box, but illness prevented that from happening. So I'll be back, of course, as soon as I can when I've made enough progress on the next section of the layout. But for now, I hope you enjoyed that. Take care, and I'll be back soon.